a decade ago when I was considering coming back to Jacksonville, my hometown, for this job, and having a conversation with Karen, who's here today, about the job and the fact that WJCT Public Media was a community organization owned by the community, not beholden to a larger institution. And that was a draw for me then. That was something that I was attracted to the idea that we had to be extremely relevant to the audience that we were serving to survive. A little bit scary, but a great opportunity. And now fast forward over a decade later, and I couldn't have imagined the journey that would take and how much more connected I would feel to the audience, to the community that we're serving. Today with Jacksonville Today, we have approaching 60,000 daily subscribers to the newsletter who we are, with the support of many of you in this room, we've reached that milestone. And we are having that daily conversation, that one-on-one feedback. And I'm just so lucky. I feel so lucky to be in the position that I'm in. So I'd like to introduce our guest today, Stephen George. He's the head of emerging markets for the American Journalism Project. And prior to that, he was also the CEO of Louisville Public Media. And he continues to be a board member for NPR at the national level. So a little bit about American Journalism Project, if you could start us there. It describes itself as venture philanthropy. What does that mean?
Great question. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. It's nice to see many familiar faces and also nice to get to know some of you as well. I hope we can all have a chance to talk before we wrap here. So venture philanthropy. So we were founded by, in part, a man named John Thornton, who was an Austin, Texas-based venture capitalist. And one day, he and his firm were looking at a local newspaper property as a potential acquisition. And he was deep into the diligence, and he was very alarmed. And he looked up at his partners and he said, if what I see here is true for this paper in this major American city, what does it look like across the rest of the country? And I think, we all know how that story has played out, unfortunately. And so I think right away, John had a deep sense of the scale of the challenge that was coming as the transformation of local news, commercial-based local news for the most part, was beginning. And so he launched the American Journalism Project with Elizabeth Green as his co-founder, with the idea that we had to have scaled solutions in order to meet this dramatic emergent challenge. So the way we approach it is AJP is a funder. We raise money nationally over the 6 years that we have been in existence. We've raised about $250 million nationally. We have invested it in a portfolio of local news organizations. There are 54 of them in 37 states, DC and Puerto Rico right now. We continue to invest at a clip of 4 to 6 organizations a year. We only invest in their business side operations. And I think that's really important. That's really an important part of why we call ourselves a venture philanthropy and the way we think about things here. There is an extraordinary amount and a growing amount of philanthropy, both at the local and national level, supporting the vital work of reporters and editors and photographers and digital producers every single day. There is very, very little philanthropy focused on maturing business operations and helping support that in an ongoing and sustainable way. And so that's our focus. We do deep research and we make big bets because, again, the scale of the challenge that we're facing, I think, is calls for that.
Okay, speaking of big bets, sometimes bets do not pay off. So I'm going to ask you about one example of a failure, you could say, the Houston landing. It was a grantee of the American Journalism Project and received $20 million in seed funding and shut down after 2 years. So what lessons do you take from that situation?
I'm glad you asked about that. Houston Landing has gotten a lot of attention over the past 6 months, 7 months, somewhere around there. And I want to say before I answer the question that some of the attention it's gotten obscures the extraordinary success of the vast majority of the portfolio. So I mentioned 54 news organizations. 40 of them are active grantees of AJP right now. And in aggregate, last year alone generated $130 million of recurring revenue. They employ more than 1,000 journalists and more than 300 business side people across the country. So I think our portfolio year over the past 3 years has grown an average of 22% in terms of renewable revenue. So we feel good about that. We mentioned venture philanthropy. I think we all understand that, when you make big bets, sometimes there is risk involved. And so I would put our success rate up against just about any one of them out there. However, with Houston Landing, AJP made an initial investment as part of that $20 million in seed funding. Typically, when we do that, we would take a board seat on the startup, and we would put them into what we call our startup studio program. So basically, we have, as part of our organization, a team of professionals who have done this time and time again and who are deeply experienced news folks and business side folks who know how to build successful news organizations. We did not do that with Houston Landing. It was the choice of that board of directors. I think some of their strategic challenges or maybe missteps included, they didn't really create a differentiated product. So it's really important now, if you come in here and you want to create something new like Jax Today, for example, how's it going to be different than what you can already get in the market, right? And it can't just be our version of the City Hall story is a little bit different from their version of the City Hall story. Nobody's going to want that, and nobody's going to connect with that. And I think that differentiation was a real problem for them. And so, when you come into a city like Houston, you create the Houston Chronicle, but worse, you're not going to be successful.
And what is the AJP's interest in Jacksonville specifically?
Well, I just wanted to spend more time here. So we are working with a group of local institutional philanthropists right now to, over the course of the next year or so, to study the media ecosystem here, to learn about where original reporting capacity lies, how those stories move across the ecosystem and reach residents or don't. We'll do a deep community listening exercise where we'll speak to probably on the order of 1,000 or so residents here to understand what their needs, wants, and desires are as it pertains to local news and information. We do a gap analysis. We work with a group of local leaders on this all along the way to make sure we're putting it into the right context. We're understanding, we have credibility in what we do. So, for example, not saying that, that a neighborhood that is bisected by a river is just one place, right? Little things like that. And then we put together a gap analysis and then a strategy for radical new investment in local news. And then we go out and lead that movement, lead that charge. AJP typically makes a direct investment in these projects as well. I want to be very clear, though, that there's not a predetermined outcome to these. So we are guided by research. We are guided by local voices who are our partners along the way. And we always start when we look at the ecosystem with the assets that exist already. So you mentioned the startup at Houston Landing and several of the other startups we've done. We launched the LA Local this year as a new startup in partnership with LAS, the public media station there, and the LA Times and several others. We launched the Tulsa Flyer in Oklahoma last year, launched Mirror Indy several years ago in Indianapolis. Those are several of the examples of the startups. We also do investments in existing organizations. We do transformation. We help engage them for their strategic plans. So that's a lot of what we'll be doing. We have a question back here if we wanted to jump real quick into that.
John.
I think you have a unique media ecosystem here. You have a lot of entrepreneurship, a lot more than many places your size. And the WJCT and Jax Today is certainly one example. They stand out in the public media universe. Florida Trib is another example. They stand out in the sort of nonprofit, local news ecosystem in a lot of big ways. You have a newspaper that is still producing in a way that many are no longer able to. And then you have rooms like this, which is not typical. I'm not blowing smoke. Part of what I get to do at AJP is go around to all these different cities across the country and meet with folks like you and learn about local news ecosystem, who cares about it, who understands it as a public service and a public good as opposed to sort of a commercial enterprise and a transaction-based relationship. Rooms like this are rare.
Right. We are seeing that here in Jacksonville, that people are hearing that message that journalism is a public good. They understand the bad things that happen when it does not exist. However, and I'm going to quote here from one of our former lunch guests, Dick Toffel, who is the former ProPublica publisher. And he said, institutional foundations talk a big game about funding where others will not. They are also notoriously strategically fickle and deeply allergic to permanent commitment. So how do you, as AJP, compel philanthropy to continue to support? And should it?
So we make decisions about the things that matter to us outside of a commercial context. Probably the best example is the arts. The arts, orchestra, museums, opera, ballet, etc. That's a $3 billion a year philanthropic endeavor in this country. I think we have plenty of proof points that local news and information should sit in a similar place in terms of the public good and public benefit. Also, its susceptibility to markets in the way that we see them now, right? So if we could get local news up to 1/3 of what we give the arts every year, it would totally transform local news in every community across this country. Totally transform it, right? We believe at AJP that philanthropy plays a couple of important roles. One, as catalyst. And so, we work with philanthropies and individual philanthropists locally and nationally, right? In the communities like this where we are active and trying to build and sort of add on to the movement that already exists there. Our case is whatever you care about, whether it's educational outcomes, clean water, a healthy, thriving local government, access to health care, disaster preparedness. I could go on and on. Journalism and local news ought to be your number 2 issue, because if people don't know about the problems that are facing your community, or if people know how to engage in them in a positive way to move towards solutions, then we're not going to solve anything. And so that's where I would position sort of local news and philanthropy. So catalytic capital, and then ongoing support. I'd say that a healthy local news organization in maturity probably is about 1/3 funded by local philanthropy.
Well, changing gears a little bit from philanthropy to individual reader support, getting the readers to want to pay for what they are reading. So you don't miss David too much. I'm going to quote a statistic here. From a recent Pew study, 8% of the respondents said that they felt it was their responsibility to pay for news. Okay. So hearing this, there are different models out there. Some new digital news organizations are using paywalls. Nonprofits even are using paywalls, right? We are not at the moment doing that. What do you think about that? And should it be free for everybody to read?
So at AJP, we believe it should be free for everybody to read, and it should be free and accessible not only to the individual, but also to other news organizations. Because we believe in that collaboration is key to a healthy and successful local news ecosystem. I would quibble a little bit with the use of the term responsibility in that stat. I think do we tell people that they have a responsibility to buy Netflix? Do we tell people they have a responsibility to subscribe to Apple One or whatever it's called, Apple Plus TV, whatever? You get what I'm getting at here. We're in competition for people's attention, and we have to treat it that way. And I think we should not treat our end user as someone who, we're sort of saying, you should help for this, you should help with this because it's a public good, and say, this provides you entertainment. This provides you value. This provides you a connection to your community. Is that worth $5 to you? Is that worth $10 to you? Right? That's a sort of a different way to think about it. I think that putting the whole of the challenge of local news onto the consumer is a strategic misstep for us. And so we ought to think about ways to engage them that are sort of more in step with their daily lives and routines, right? You asked about the paywall model.
Mm-hmm.
I gave AJP's position. That is also my personal position on this. That said, I think what like the Baltimore Banner is doing, Daily Memphian is doing, these are interesting experiments that we should watch carefully and try to understand, right? Because it does show how individual consumers of local news would behave when asked to pay for it. And that's really important for us to really, really understand.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on what the goals should be as far as how much of your audience should be paying for it? What's ideal?
30 to 50%, I think. And it kind of depends on what the rest of your revenue mix is. I said, at a steady state, at maturity, that, philanthropy should be about a third. When I say philanthropy, I'm not talking about individual readers at $5 a month. I'm talking about, institutional philanthropy and individuals at like a 5,000 plus kind of level, right? So I think that's maybe a third. I think it depends on your community. What's your local business community like? Do you get a lot of support, or are you able to get a lot of support from corporate sponsorship? If so, pursue it. That should be a part of your revenue mix, no question. Events should be probably part of your revenue mix as well. But I think that if you're delivering a real value to the individual and to your community, your revenue line should reflect that too.
So our product that we focused on first was our newsletter. We were newsletter first at Jax Today, and we've also invested in our website and our presence there. A lot of people are getting their information elsewhere on social media. 47% of people believe that they don't have to actively seek out information and news. It will just find them. And who knows what they're getting when it finds them, right? So as a local news organization, what do you think is our obligation to be in those spaces where people are finding their information, even if it doesn't have an obvious business case for us?
I just go all in on TikTok. This is a really hard question. And as a Gen Xer, I don't like any of these things very much personally. I think they're very important. I think if half the population is telling you that they're just getting news and they don't even really know where it's from, I think we have an imperative to be present there and to be active there and to be good there, right? And so I also understand that there are other pressures involved here, right? I've run and been a part of a number of local newsrooms, some small, some better resourced. And in every one of them, there's a day-to-day question of, well, who's going to make the video? And who's going to translate that story into this? And who's going to, create the graphics for that? It's a really hard thing to do. And often when your primary job is producing local news on a daily basis, that's an afterthought, right? So I think this is something that has to be a part of your business plan. It's not going to make you revenue, but it is where people are. And, so I think that it should align in a couple of key ways. One, it has to align with your values. So, like him or not, when Elon Musk bought Twitter and changed it to X, a lot of things changed. There are a number of news organizations that decided to get off of that platform because they didn't believe that the changes aligned with their values. That's an example, right? So maybe you don't want to put your resources there if that's not aligned for you. I would also say that if you have a TV operation, for example, you maybe have some core capability in video that others don't. And so maybe that's an opportunity for a TikTok or an Instagram Reels or something like that. Businesses always have loss leaders, and you should think about this as one. It is important to be present where people are. That is a core function of good local news. It doesn't have to be your primary function.
Okay, so switching gears to the topic of government support. Over the past year, of course, a lot has been made of the fact that federal funding for public media has been turned off. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting has disbanded. There are other things happening in the realm of government funding, though. So there's an example from Illinois. That state passed a law that's a year old that gives payroll tax credits to local news organizations. It's already paid out $4 million to those organizations. Is that kind of model compelling? Is that something we could see here?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. I think to think seriously about restoring public funding for media at this political moment is a waste of time. But I think that there are a lot of creative ways that states are looking at how to support local news organizations. There's another one where, local businesses get a credit for advertising in local publications or on local radio stations or in local outlets, right? I think these things, much like the sort of paywall conversation around Baltimore Banner, this is worth looking at. This is interesting. It is hopefully would be helpful to your revenue mix as an operator, but it is not going to be anything that changes the game for you. And I think that public funding in general, the CPB has disbanded. So this is probably something that isn't coming back for a while, if ever. And it requires, I think, a pretty profound reconsideration of how what government funding's role is in news media.
Okay, this is a natural transition to talking a little bit more about public media and NPR. You have station leadership experience. You're now helping guide NPR through what's a really interesting time. So first, I'd just like to do a quick funding lesson here in the room. This is, and you can jump in if I get any of this wrong, because it's complicated. Congress, okay, so this is how it used to work, right? Congress would send the money to the CPB, which granted money to the stations, to the public media organizations, including WJCT Public Media. And we would use that money to then pay NPR as a member. So NPR was a membership organization and simultaneously is a producer of content, which we would buy from NPR and other producers to air. So it's a dual, we would use that money in a dual way to pay for membership and content. Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Today, so always there's been inherently a tension as NPR is in those dual roles. Today, there's even more interesting tension and challenges ahead because of the lack of federal funding. So let's just start there. Where do you see the landscape that NPR is facing over the next 5 years going?
That's an easy question. So some thoughts on this. It's a very complex set of formulas that get us to that funding breakdown that you beautifully described. But there is a very simple premise behind it, which is that we use common technology to deliver educational programming to the masses, in particular people who can't access it otherwise, right? Is that a government imperative or not? I think we have our answer right now. right? For the time being. So we should take that answer and understand and move on, right? NPR's differentiator, we talked about differentiators earlier. NPR's differentiator is its station network. NPR itself has 900 employees. Most of their news operations are based in and focused on Washington, D.C., and they're, I think 13 or 14 international bureaus around the world. Then they have a network of 243 stations, including WJCT, who employ more than 2,000 journalists in every corner of this country, right? And the opportunity we have now that we are no longer constricted by a federal funding formula that creates a whole bunch of different tiers and categories of membership and all of this stuff is, can we treat that like a local national network that sort of is a two-way street? So wherever you are, you can get a taste of where you are, as well as the sort of discovery and richness of life in all of these other places across the country. That is to me, the real promise of the NPR network. There are funding mechanisms that can, based on decisions that will be outside of the board's control, and largely at the local level, there are ways you can activate and better support that network through funding and fees. There are ways that you can do it through licensing and brand. There are a lot of different avenues here. But I think that what has happened with the loss of federal funding is an earthquake that that has never hit the public media system before and is unlikely to hit it again. And we have some things that remain that are worth saving, preserving, and investing in. We have other things that we really now need to focus on rebuilding. And so I think that it's an extraordinary, it is very hard to say this is a moment of opportunity, because for the daily practitioner, it is very, very hard. It is very hard. But I think at a system level, it is a moment of reinvention and opportunity.
It's also a moment of reflection, right? And part of that reflection, I think, has to include, we remember a couple of years back, longtime business news editor at NPR, Uri Berliner, he wrote a piece called "Here's How We Lost America's Trust," which in his opinion referred to examples of bias in NPR's coverage. What is your response to that? Does NPR have a bias problem?
Pass. No, this is a really important, there are a lot of layers here. So first of all, it is right and good to challenge NPR or any other news organization when you perceive it falling short of what you expect. Baseline, right? I think there are a lot of examples of NPR contextualizing political stories in ways that might lead you to believe that they are biased, right? So, for example, you're listening to Morning Edition, and there is a host that's setting up a conversation with a Republican lawmaker in a way that is, maybe a little less friendly or conversational than a Democratic lawmaker. I myself have seen 20 minutes of that. Is that bias actively? I'm not sure. I think it's a good exercise to go through and test yourself on these questions. I also think this is a bit of a red herring right now. And I think that news organizations are getting tripped up by focusing too much on this question of bias as it's being presented, and focusing less on ways to attract audiences who you can whose trust you can earn. I think that, there's not evidence, just taking him at face value, there's not evidence that we've lost America's trust at NPR. Our audience is extraordinarily large. We're reaching nearly a third of the country on a weekly basis on all formats. right? Compare that to the highest rated show on MSNBC or CNN or Fox News, where they're reaching 3 to 5 million people a night. That's an extraordinary difference, right? And so I think that we have to keep these sort of conversations in the appropriate context. Could NPR do better in the way they present certain stories that are politically charged? 1,000%, right? 1,000%. But I think that this sort of claim of bias against NPR has been a little bit overinflated.
Okay, speaking of trust, going back to our Pew statistics, right? 51% of respondents find it difficult to trust or determine the information that they're seeing is true or not. Who can blame them? With officials in some cases doctoring images, with plenty of AI-generated content out there to trick us every moment. Also, at the same time, when asked about just trust in news, trust in local news remains 20% higher than trust in national news. But at the same time, across all demographics, across all political affiliations, trust has been going down in local news as well. So, as a local news organization, how can we prove that we are worth that trust?
I think be transparent. Certainly when you screw up, but in the course of your work generally, I think there's been a long time view held in newsrooms across America that we go to the office every day knowing what's happening in our community, and we're just here to tell everybody. And I think that's not the way news works anymore. It's certainly not the way communities work anymore, and the way they understand themselves and their connection to each other and to institutions. And so local newsrooms, by and large, have been very slow to this transformation. It's a very hard transformation, big culture change, right? But I think you have to show up in your community on a daily basis, right? And that means being present, yes, at events, but also knowing who to talk to at the school board meeting to really understand what's happening, and orienting your coverage to answer people's questions, not heighten conflict and misunderstanding. I think with AI, which I kind of think is it's hard to understand what's real and all of that stuff. It's another argument for being present on these platforms in a big way. I think AI is something different. We could really derail this conversation going there, but I think sort of AI slop, if we throw up our hands and say, as local news providers, well, that's just awful and people are idiots if they believe it, then we're giving up a huge portion of the people we ought to be serving and helping understand their environment.
I want to open it up to the room for some Q&A. Does anybody want to be first? Yes.
The question was, why did I overlook or exclude local television when I was talking about the work that we're going to be doing here? And that was my bad. Unintentional. We always work with local TV as well. And then what are some examples of innovation around local TV partnerships? That's a great question. It's not an intentional omission at all. We include local TV news in all of the work that we do. I think that there's a lot of innovation happening in local TV news right now. There's also a lot of change that is not happening. But let me talk about some of the sort of bright spots that I see and some of the green shoots that I've seen around the country. I am working on a project in Miami-Dade County right now, and WPLG has just done something very interesting. They have divorced ABC and become all local. They are going from, and this is a wild stat, they're going from 53 hours of original local programming per week to 96. That's a lot. That's a lot, right? And so guess what they need? Trusted local reporters, editors, news organizations to help them fill the news hole, right? It's an amazing opportunity for WLRN, for example, the public media station there. It's an amazing opportunity for some of the local startups there to get visibility because WPLG has a huge viewership, right? And it's great for PLG because they have a content hold that is really, really expensive to fix on their own, right? That's a really great opportunity. Another example, we did this actually when I was running Louisville Public Media. We partnered with one time the local NBC affiliate and one time the local WDRB, the local Fox affiliate, WDRB. Our deal with those partnerships, they came to us saying, "Hey, you're doing great investigative reporting. We'd love to package up some of your work for TV," right? And what I said was, "No, no, no. We're going to put up 3 journalists on this project. We want you to put up 3 journalists on this project, and we'll make it so much better. And we'll make a radio first version of it. We'll make a text first version of it, and we'll make a TV first version of it, because all 3 of those are fundamentally different presentations of the same material and have to be." I see a lot of that happening. I think you guys are doing some of that too, with Florida Trib right now. I think that's some of the most exciting kind of collaboration and interplay with local TV.
Did we have a question over here?
Talking about the now that federal funding is gone, what do you do about the federal mandates to create programming such as children's programming? That is not my area of expertise, so I'll be upfront in saying that. And you may have a different answer because you work with PBS some, but I actually think there's a good market for children's programming in particular, and the absence. That might be a place where federal funding could come back in a non-controversial way. Just throwing out as a possibility. I think that, we are in a moment where Congress eliminated federal funding for all of this, and now is sort of saying, well, wait a second, what about Alaska? There's a lot of conversation about do we return federal funding for Alaska stations who are doing a service that is fundamentally different from everything else in the continental United States. Children's programming may fall into that category as well. I don't know if you have a better answer. It's a good question.
I don't. Isaiah.
Yeah. The question from Isaiah was about the mix of philanthropy as ongoing support for local news organizations. It does change based on where you are. The 1/3 number, not exactly arbitrary. It's based on what we've seen as is needed in kind of mature organizations that have grown their other revenue streams. So for example, you're not going to get an organization that is 100% reader funded, right? We've not seen that work. We've not seen one work that is 100% sponsorship funded or even 75% sponsorship funded. It's just the market has changed so much for that it's not viable right now. Where we see it settling in is usually anywhere in terms of local philanthropy's ongoing support is it averages out to be about 1/3, but in different communities it's more or less. So you'll see some. Texas Tribune's a great example where they have a little bit lower of an ongoing philanthropic support revenue line because their events business is really big. And they do a lot of annual revenue that way. They do a lot of revenue through community, like hosting community events and things like that as well. And then they have the Trib Fest, which is like a huge sort of national event that is local to them. So that's sort of an outlier example. Then we'll see places that are, closer to 45, 50%. And to your point, that's what their communities are telling them and how they're responding to what they're doing. So usually when you see, when I say maturity, I'm talking about 5+ years at least for them to develop these kind of lines. So what we often see is that philanthropy has to play a larger role up front to build the product, to help the organization build the audience that they need to sustain. And then, as you grow trust with your readers and listeners, you're able to build that financial relationship with them as well. It's a great question. So the question was, how do you protect investigative journalism against special interests who also may have a financial interest, either a direct financial interest as a donor or supporter of your work, or well-funded enough to sue you into oblivion, basically. And so that's a really good question. And it's something that is very near and dear to me. The organization that I was CEO of, before I was CEO, I ran all their news operations and helped get the Kentucky Center for Investigative Reporting off the ground. This is an early example of, as a 6-person newsroom designed exclusively for investigative reporting, no mission creep. The only reason these people were there, and they were sort of incubated within the larger newsroom, was to do the kind of journalism that needs resource protection and allocation over time. We spent a lot of time with lawyers. We spent a lot of time defending our work. We won 6 or 7 lawsuits. As a part of that work, we lost one $250,000 donor in a single story off of that. And so what you're talking about, I have a lot of experience in and have a staunch belief of its importance. I think that you have to have a diverse enough donor base to be able to lose donors. And I think you also have to, I think you have to convey what your expectations are of the relationship on an ongoing basis between a donor or a corporate sponsor and your news organization. And I've seen instances where subjects of major investigations are also donors who stay, who don't leave, because while that caused them particular pain or harm, they understand the broader importance of that kind of work, the higher value. Exactly. And so, I think this is something that, and then on the other side of it, there are organizations like the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, which is an extraordinary resource, a national organization that helps connect local news organizations with pro bono legal support in their communities when they need it. There are local press associations all over the country where, part of your very, very low dues to them includes pre-review of stories, things like that. So, there are also resources available sort of on the front end to ensure that your journalism is bulletproof.
Any other questions? John? I'll repeat the question first. So John, a former editor, Times Union, right? He says, collaboration, understandable in this moment, especially sharing resources makes sense. However, back in the day, the fuel that fired the journalist was often competition and trying to be first. And when you embrace collaboration, are you losing something by that?
It's a great question. Something I personally struggle with as an extremely competitive person. And when I started in the news business as a reporter, I also was driven by competition and, in fact, took great joy in harassing my fellow City Hall reporters when I beat them to a story. There are not enough of us out there anymore to be competitive. It doesn't, the steel doesn't sharpen when it's not up against steel. And I think that I'm thinking about Kentucky 20 years ago when we had, 40 people in the Frankfurt News Bureau, and, you'd race and try to beat the crap out of each other to a story and then go get a bourbon at the end of the day and, joke with each other or whatever. Like those days, that's over. And it made us better back then, but there are other things that should make us better now. And I think that, part of that is understanding who you're serving and how to serve them in a way that meets their needs, not your needs. It sounds and might feel a little softer than beating somebody to the story. But I think it is the thing that sharpens our tools now, especially in local communities. That's not to say that there's not still plenty of healthy competition. I'm looking at my news friends in the room who are just sort of, it's still there. It's still there and it's still good. But it's not what it used to be because the volume of reporters and reporting is simply not there anymore.
This will be our last question.
Are there things we are worried about in terms of at a policy level, state and federal, that are not tied to federal funding, but still could be disruptive to the work of local news? Yes. First and foremost, one of the major ways that, and you opened the conversation with, sort of talking about the value of being a community licensee here, not tied to a university. 50%, 51, 52% of those 243 NPR stations across the country are tied to universities by their licenses. Universities hold those licenses. In some cases, other entities hold the license. So in Miami-Dade County, WLRN is licensed to the school board there, which creates plenty of conflicts of interest for them. And so what you have from a policy standpoint there is an opportunity, now that we're no longer getting federal funding and university priorities are changing, for stations to, is a dramatic word, but liberate themselves from university capture, right? But you have an FCC that is unlikely to approve any of those license transfers because it is overtly hostile to the work that we do. So that's a good example of, or unlikely is maybe strong, but I would question, that's a point for them to do some destruction. And I think they're pretty bent on that right now. And so that's a place, certainly, there are entanglements all throughout public media and potentially other media, but likely public media with state governments. Like West Virginia's is, their license is held by the state government and it's controlled by a state-appointed board. Guess what? When the governor is upset about that, he changes the board and then they fire the leader and then they bring in somebody else who used to work for the governor. Right? Like there is an extraordinary amount of work in resisting that pressure in those newsrooms and at those organizations, because these organizations have often provided an enormous amount of news and cultural content and connection for these communities, and now they're being sort of messed with. So I think from a public media perspective, that's it. Those are a couple of examples. State governments removing funding, things like that. Okay, all funding related. But I think that another one that we've kept our eyes on that affects smaller news organizations or startup news organizations is how the federal government is granting 501 status. So, you start up a new local news organization, you have to go get approved for your 501c3. When you raise your hand and say, yeah, we're going to do local news, are they going to stop you up? I think those are legitimate questions that are sort of unique to this political moment we're in, but, and that I hope don't persist.
We won't end on threats. When you and I met for coffee this morning, I said, I wonder if this conversation is just going to bum everybody out, right? So you responded that, no, you are actually extremely optimistic. Can you talk us out on that note, please?
Yes, I can. I get through my job to visit communities across the country who are doing interesting, new, and innovative things to address the challenges of scaled local news. And in every one of those places, I get to meet with the founders, the practitioners, and the supporters who believe in this and are doing innovative things to grow. You have excellent examples, standout examples here in this community. Jax Today is a huge innovation in the public media world. Florida Trib doing absolutely extraordinary work now with their eye on a statewide expansion plan. Really going to fill a gap, by the way, in statewide local news that's available in this state. I think that, we are 12 to 15 years into a 20-year transformation cycle, maybe something like that. So hold on, it's still moving. and it probably still will move for a long time. But as I go around the country and meet with people like you, these rooms are getting more and more crowded. And people, the idea that local news is a public good that's not just worth saving the scraps of, but that is worth investing in and transforming and making a suite of products that will meet people where they are and give them something that's different and new. That is alive and well. And I think that we're seeing some challenges related to funding with public media. Public media has an extraordinary opportunity right now as well to reinvent itself and its notion of public service and connection to community, right? And could probably learn things from what folks like Deirdre are doing in their newsrooms to meet people where they are, and vice versa, right? And so I think that what we're seeing now is sort of this growing and strong and connected community of practitioners who are learning from one another and doing innovative new things. And the door is wide open for that right now. And crucially, people are understanding the need to support that financially as well. And where, we're a venture philanthropy, we talk about return, not in terms of dollars, but in terms of public good, better public policy, more connected communities, more parents who know how to, get their kids through the public school system, on and on and on. I mean, the benefits are enormous. I don't need to convince you all, but that's why I'm excited. That's why I'm still very, very happy with the work that I'm doing.
Thank you. And yes.